Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby-Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are pleased to welcome this fantastic panel to campus this evening for a timely discussion of the challenges of regulating Facebook. After tonight, we have one more program at the IOP until classes resume in October. That will be Friday afternoon. As part of Alumni Weekend, David Axelrod will be leading a discussion on the 2018 midterm elections. And the panel will feature several members of the IOP's stellar board of advisors. You can find out more about this event and others and other programs at the IOP on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. There you can also sign up for our newsletter, which is the best way to stay informed once our programs start again in the fall. As usual, we will have audience questions tonight after our conversation, and we will ask that the first three questions come from students. We will have a microphone in the center aisle for you. We ask you to please remember that questions end in a question mark and to keep them brief so that we can get through as many as possible. At this point, please put your phones on silent. And here to formally introduce our speakers is Baxter Stein. Baxter is a fourth year from Westport, Connecticut, studying public policy with a specialization in tech policy. He even wrote his thesis on the regulation of algorithms and big tech. Baxter has held several positions at the IOP, including Fellows Ambassador and Speaker Series Intern. This year, he is the Fellows Chair on our Student Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming Baxter to the podium.
Thanks, Gretchen, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. Just last week, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg apologized to EU lawmakers, and he admitted that the company had not done enough to prevent misuse on his platform, and that regulation is something that is both important and inevitable. And so in many ways, regulation has already arrived through new data protection rules implemented by the EU just a few days ago. But there are also many other forms of regulation of Facebook that might happen in the US, everything from the way the company handles user privacy, political ads, fake news, and even hate speech. And with all the buzz in Washington, many questions still remain. Are lawmakers capable of understanding fast-changing technology enough to regulate it? How will they prioritize different forms of policymaking, and how might regulation impact other big tech companies like Google or Amazon? And so joining the IOP today to break this all down are three incredibly distinguished journalists who write on the various intersections of politics, policy, and tech. Tony Romm is a technology writer for the Washington Post, covering the influence of big tech in Washington, D.C. Nancy Scola is a senior technology reporter for Politico Pro and previously covered issues of political tech for outlets like The Atlantic, Washington Post, and Reuters. And finally, moderating tonight's panel is Kim Hart. Before arriving at her current job as managing editor at Axios, she served as press secretary for the FCC and worked as a reporter for Politico, The Hill, and the Washington Post. So please join me in welcoming Tony Romm, Nancy Scola, and Kim Hart to the Institute of Politics.
Thank you so much, Baxter, and thank you so much for having us. And that was a great overview to kick off the conversation. I wanted to just take a step back and give a broad view, a broad frame for the discussion, and then we'll get right into some questions, and then looking forward to the questions from the audience as well. As Baxter alluded to, this past year has been nothing short of a wake-up call for Facebook. The social network, along with its peers like Google and Twitter, have started with a pretty utopian purpose: to democratize information and empower free speech. Facebook was a place to connect with friends and share ideas. But over the past few years, darker forces have started to infiltrate this popular service, especially Facebook. Fake news has started to run rampant in news feeds, even though a lot of users don't even know what they're seeing is fake. Extreme, divisive, and polarizing content spreads like wildfire, and we now know that Russian actors took advantage of the open nature of a platform like Facebook to disrupt the US election by sowing confusion and igniting Americans' differences. Add to that the growing privacy concerns that Facebook in particular has made Facebook in particular a target of lawmakers in the US and governments worldwide, particularly Europe, in the past couple of weeks. The Cambridge Analytica scandal put a spotlight on how personal data is traded between online platforms and developers and advertisers. But despite a couple of days of pretty uncomfortable hearings for Mark Zuckerberg, it's unclear that Congress is any closer to meaningfully regulating Facebook. And users haven't ditched the platform either, despite all the controversy. Whether big tech firms like Facebook and Google and even Amazon and Apple and Microsoft should be regulated at all, and if so, how, remains a pretty controversial question in Washington and in other capitals worldwide. So given that backdrop, let's start with a broader view of the dynamics at play here when we talk about the so-called techlash. Nancy, why don't we start with you? Can you talk a little bit about how we got here in the first place?
Absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank you all for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. It's fun to be here. And I want to hijack the conversation for just 1 second and ask, how many of you consider yourselves active Facebook users? Okay, so what is that, about half maybe? Okay, just to get a read of the room. You never know, it depends on the room these days.
Good idea.
So just to give a little bit of backstory of how I came into this, which I swear is in response to your question. Before going to journalism, I worked on Capitol Hill doing government oversight work in the House of Representatives. One of the formative experiences I had on Capitol Hill doing tech policy was when Google opened its office up in Washington, D.C. It was in 2005, and everyone thought, what the heck is Google doing opening an office in Washington, D.C.? What do they have to come here and talk about, right? There's nothing relevant to them in Washington. So they were alone for a couple years working out of sort of a co-working space. They slowly developed their own office. Other companies decided, hey, it's not a bad idea for us to have offices in Washington, D.C. too. Again, that's not that long ago, maybe a decade ago. At the time, these offices were opening up in Washington, D.C. Silicon Valley was the one part of the United States that was really working very well. Silicon Valley was on the rise. They were making a ton of money. They were building things that were free and pretty neat. Nothing else was working all that well in the United States, right? 2008, the economy is sort of collapsing. And in some ways, I would make the argument that the technology industry was given a little bit of a free ride in Washington during the years that followed, because people thought this is something that if you're a politician, your approval ratings are minimal. Silicon Valley is something you can kind of attach yourself to, is something that's working in the United States. So I think that carried on for a long time. It's carried on until pretty recently, I think. And I think what happened was there was a little bit, I think you can make the argument that the industry was allowed to run wild a little bit when people woke up to the power of the industry during the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. They took a step back, and you could argue that they overreacted in some ways, or we're in that period of overreaction of, hey, we paid no attention to it, now we're going to pay a ton of attention to it. So I think that's where the point that we're at right now. I think what we're going to see from here is sort of the balancing out of that of, hey, this is something Washington regulators and lawmakers have to pay attention to. Figuring out how we actually go about that is the sort of fascinating period we're in right now, is my argument.
And Tony, can you talk a little bit about the Trump factor here and the dynamics that helped bring Trump to the White House and what that new environment means?
Yeah, and just to echo Nancy, thank you guys so much for having us. We really enjoy being here. I think there are two things that have collided. The first are the problems that Nancy and Kim have outlined with the tech industry itself and some of the challenges that Facebook and others now face in policing the content that appears on its platform. And these are not invented things, to be clear. Just to give an example, when we're talking with Facebook and the 2016 election, 10 million people in the United States saw these ads taken out by Russian agents, and 140 million or more on both Facebook and Instagram may have seen content by Russian trolls on their profiles and pages and on their Instagram feeds. So these aren't things that are invented. These are real problems that a company like Facebook faces. So there's this desire to correct those problems, or perhaps overcorrect those problems, among those lawmakers who feel that Silicon Valley has run wild. But politically speaking, we're at this moment where both parties are skeptical of bigness. You have folks like Senator Elizabeth Warren on the left, obviously a progressive voice, talking very loudly about corporate consolidation, not just in tech, but throughout the rest of the economy. And we have the president saying similar things sometimes. Steve Bannon, when he served at the White House for a period of time, reportedly had talked openly about treating tech companies like utilities. Now, it was never exactly clear what Bannon had in mind and what regulating a tech company like a utility would mean, but the implication there was that there would be more regulation perhaps on the way. So you have that piece of the politics here. Then you add on top of that the fact that Trump was elected to try to save some of these old industries. Trump wasn't talking about tech during the campaign trail. He wasn't like Obama, for instance, who spoke at Google headquarters during the 2008 race. For Trump, it was about fighting against some of those forces of automation and artificial intelligence, even if he didn't mention them by name. And then lastly, you have some of his political disputes. For many, many reasons, the president is at war with Jeff Bezos, who, we should be clear, runs Amazon, and Jeff Bezos in particular owns the Washington Post, but Amazon does not own the Post. And there's been that feud there that sort of impacted the tech industry and its relationship in Washington. So there are many levels to all of this.
Yeah, and I think both what you guys said was spot on. Another thing that kind of goes along with both of that is this rise of Silicon Valley over the past 10 to 15 years was seen as such a great force for the economy. At large. I mean, it really was. These companies are now the economic drivers of not only the US, but in many ways the world. And so there was all of this economic growth and massive, king-making going on out in California. Meanwhile, other industries were kind of falling away due to globalization that helped to fuel the rise of Silicon Valley. So you have this kind of bubble of Silicon Valley that was just thriving and growing gangbusters, yet the rest of the country, particularly in the Rust Belt and other Midwestern places, were really struggling and feeling left behind. And I think that that's something that Silicon Valley really missed. And it's what I think a lot of East Coasters, particularly in Washington, missed too, and that helped fuel the rise of Trump. But once Trump got there, it was also this strange dynamic, and you guys probably saw this too, that even though a lot of the tech companies thought, well, we hate Trump, we don't like the fact that he's in the White House, but he's Republican, so he's not gonna regulate, he's not gonna want to touch us. And then almost the opposite happened, where it was like this populist rise came in, and with the Bannon's talk and the anti-bigness, and look at these companies that have just kind of like run roughshod over the rest of the American economy. And so everyone was, I feel like the first year of the Trump administration was just kind of this like whirling dervish of like change that no one really knew what to make of it. And then I think what started to crystallize the conversation was the Russian investigation in Congress, and that's where things started to really get going. And on that point, that's when I think the public started to notice it too, right? So at Axios, we did a couple of polls with the polling firm SurveyMonkey to gauge public perception of tech companies and their views of regulation. So in November, this was right after Facebook, Google, and Twitter testified before Congress about their role in the US election and how their platform was used by foreign actors, particularly in Russia. Only about 4 in 10 Americans were concerned that the government wouldn't do enough to regulate the tech company. Fast forward 3 months later, in February, we asked the exact same questions just to see where, if public perception had moved or stayed. I kind of expected it to be hovering around the same place. But I was surprised to see that that number had jumped from 40% to 55% of the people who were concerned that the government wouldn't do enough. So the flip side of that is that they wanted the government to be doing more. That's the first time that we'd seen a majority of respondents say that tech should be more regulated. And even 45% of Republicans, who are, like I said, usually more skeptical of government regulation, said government may not be doing enough. So Tony, through your reporting, what are you seeing change in terms of public opinion? And do you think that change or in the mood toward big tech is influencing what's happening on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I think one of the important things about the poll that you pointed out that you guys at Axios did that maybe isn't so clear is that there actually isn't a whole lot of polling on this issue, and thinking through some of the public policy ramifications when it comes to the tech industry. We were sitting at the Post just a couple days ago asking the extent to which voters think about tech as an issue that's on their minds come election day. You know, we have plenty of surveys where we gauge what voters think and what motivates them to go to the polls and the issues that they vote on, whether it's immigration or climate change or gun control or whatnot. But you know, you think about it, more than half of you raised your hands as being Facebook users. Potentially all of you have been impacted by the major hack on Equifax, a credit reporting agency. Perhaps your names, your social security numbers, and even more have been stolen by hackers. These are things that have real-world implications on us and our pocketbooks and our day-to-day lives, but do people actually make decisions at the ballot box in supporting a candidate who might do what those voters told you guys, which is go far enough with text? So there are a lot of unanswered questions on the public polling front. What we do know, though, is that people tend to react very emotionally and very viscerally when something like Cambridge Analytica happens. There was a whole campaign called Delete Facebook that emerged shortly after the revelations that Cambridge Analytica had absconded with about 87 million Facebook users' personal information, things like their names and the pages that they liked and some of their interests on the site. Now, again, to the point about folks maybe not translating their outrage into meaningful action, if you talk to Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg said in an earnings call that it was basically negligible. The campaign to delete Facebook was negligible. So there are so many competing pressures here. We know people are upset and they want change, but we also know that it's not actually affecting their behavior, and it may not be affecting lawmakers' behavior because the stakes for them are low at the ballot box.
What do you think, Nancy?
So one of the neat things that's happening right now is that Europe is going through an experiment with changing some of their regulations around the internet that Americans are going to be able to benefit from seeing how it plays out for them. So if folks have been paying attention to this, the General Data Protection Regulation is something that was introduced just Friday after 2 years of preparation that strengthens protections on online data. So it gives users the ability to export, delete, what's sort of other...
You can download your data.
Download, yeah, move to new services, that sort of thing. The idea is giving users control of their data with the sense behind it that it actually belongs to them. So the complaint of folks in the tech industry and even some American lawmakers and regulators is that it's a sort of a fuzzy collection of ideas that no one knows how they're going to work in conjunction out in the real world. We're going to get to see that play out in the next sort of months and years and see how Europeans like it. The sort of early reviews have been pretty positive on the European side. Just anecdotally, people are pretty thrilled that under GDPR, one of the things that companies had to do was to re-ask people if they wanted to be on their if people wanted to be on their mailing lists, and people sort of had this purging of their inboxes that people seem to really enjoy. The question is if services become unavailable to European users. There were some early publications that said, you know what, it's too much to comply with these new regulations. We're just going to make ourselves inaccessible to European users. Obviously, Europeans did not enjoy that very much. Mm-hmm. So we'll see how those rules play out there. And then if on the US side of things, one of the things that we're dealing with is that Americans have never tried it any other way. The internet has been the way the internet has been since the sort of last 15, 20 years of sort of the commercial popular internet. So when we say to folks, would you like more privacy online? It's sort of tough for them to say, no, I don't want any more privacy online.
What does that look like? Right.
If the trade-off is, would you like more privacy online, or would you like to pay for your Gmail inbox a certain amount of year to actually pay for that server capacity? They might have a different response to that. Yeah, so I don't think we know. As Tony mentioned, there's not a ton of insight that we have. I would love there to be more polling on the sort of particulars of this, but it's not on the top of mind for political pollsters
yet.
Yeah,
and an interesting test is going to come if this initiative in California does make it onto the ballot. The state of California, there's this big push to put on the ballot this year a privacy measure, and there are lots of folks on both sides of the issue who think this is not a great way of addressing privacy. It would give people, for instance, the opportunity to sue companies if their data is mishandled from a security perspective. There are a lot of folks who believe that maybe that isn't the right solution, but if they reach the threshold of signatures, and we believe they have, it's being validated by the state, privacy is going to be something that voters are confronted with in the state of California. And to the question, if they see it, do you support more privacy? Depending on how the ballot proposition is worded, how are people going to react? And what does that say about the power of the tech companies to battle back initiatives? What does it say about the ability of folks on the opposite side to rally voters around a public policy issue in the tech space? What does it say about our general understanding as people of the ways that companies collect information and the trade-offs that we make in giving Facebook access to so much information? It's just an interesting thing to watch come November, if it gets on there.
Just one more thing on that. Some of those proposals, we saw early resistance in Silicon Valley to the privacy proposals in California. Then they realized they were getting a good deal of popular attention and popular support, and they sort of shifted a little bit. One of the new talking points, as of last week, I think, that was going around, you all probably heard this too, is, well, of course, amongst tech industry lobbyists, of course we see privacy as a fundamental right. It's just how we interpret that now and sort of like create the mechanisms around protecting that. We think Europe is going the wrong direction, but of course we treat it as a fundamental right, which is actually, if you take a step back, pretty significant shift for the industry, but they're realizing that that's something they have to say at this point.
Yeah, it's just so interesting. Rohit Chopra is one of the new Democratic commissioners at the Federal Trade Commission. He was just sworn in a few days ago. And the FTC, for those who don't follow the nerdy stuff that I care about as closely, it's like that agency is the cop on the beat when it comes to the tech industry. If a company really makes a mistake on privacy and security, the FTC is going after them, and that agency is investigating Facebook right now with the Cambridge Analytica controversy. So they could issue huge fines as a result of that. So it's definitely a place to watch. But one of the things that Commissioner Chopra told me a couple days ago when we were writing about Europe is that Americans just aren't used to having protections in privacy or anything else that's essentially mandated by another country. A lot of companies have changed some of their practices here in the United States in response to GDPR, and it's so interesting and perhaps awkward to have more privacy protections in the US because of what foreign regulators have done. And so, now you have folks here who are trying to use Europe as leverage to get more privacy protections in law in the United States, but it's just something that I don't even think is set well with folks who do want to see more privacy protection here in the US.
Right, and it becomes a bit of a competitive issue too, where you have these large companies like Microsoft that put 300 engineers focused specifically on GDPR compliance. Not many companies have the resources to do that. So when you're talking about the concerns that these companies are too big and that we need to make it more possible for the young upstarts to come in and take them on and disrupt the markets and become more competitive to them and give them a run for their money, but yet you also have these, what some people, which are pretty onerous regulations compared to what they're used to, it actually keeps the scales tipped in favor of the big guys because they have the resources to comply and make sure that they're not running afoul of European regulators, whereas a startup with 25 people may, to your point, Nancy, just say, I can't do this, I can't compete, I don't have the resources. And I think Mark Zuckerberg actually pointed that out in his hearings of like, we can comply with these rules, but actually the next startup, in a college dorm or a basement may not be able to, and we may actually be hurting the system. I'm not sure if that is resonating on one side or another, but that seems to be an argument that I hear all the time.
Which creates an interesting dynamic in Washington when you have Facebook in a room and people are thinking of it as a representative of the technology industry. Yeah. And in a way, they're a representative of very profitable, very large technology companies. So they're not necessarily the voice of startups in these conversations. So when we say, of course, coming from the reflex, of course, Facebook doesn't want regulation, sometimes they're going to say, at the end of the day, as you said, we can cover it.
And so another big takeaway from the Mark Zuckerberg hearings, which were very long for those of us who had to sit through
10 hours.
10 full hours of them, they were kind of painful, that the lawmakers' grasp of how technology platforms like Facebook work is uneven at best. I mean, some of the questions were laughable. And how data flows across the internet is really complicated. I mean, how all the third parties, there are so many middlemen involved. The ad tech industry itself is so complicated and convoluted that I have a hard time keeping, I wouldn't be able to chart how my data is flowing from all of these platforms, and I cover this for a living. But Tony, given that, and also given Congress's really short attention span these days, do you think regulation is coming? And if so, what's the biggest target?
Yeah, that hearing was tough for a lot of folks, but not for Mark Zuckerberg. And just to give you guys a sense, for those who may not have seen it, like Senator Roy Blunt showed up at the hearing, the Senate version of the hearing, and was talking about how his son loves Instagram. We had other members like Senator Orrin Hatch, who at one point asked Facebook if it has advertising, which, for you guys who you've used Facebook, you've seen the web, and there were versions of that question scattered throughout 10 hours of hearings. We had a number of members question Facebook's pervasive tracking for people who aren't on the site. So if you're on, thewashingtonpost.com, how does Facebook know the information or know what you're doing there and how you got there? But many of the lawmakers were criticizing a technology that they have on their own campaign websites, just to kind of give a sense as to some of the knowledge gap there. So the gap has been big for a long, long time, and the issues are only getting more complex. Advertising is hard, but artificial intelligence and self-driving cars and drones are even harder. The considerations you have to take into effect there are more than just what happens to your information. And it just increasingly seems like lawmakers are ill-equipped. I think a lot of experts I talked to looked at the hearings in a different way. They saw the hearings not as the means to the end of regulation, but they saw the hearing as the end. They saw it as the political spectacle, the moment where lawmakers dragged Mark Zuckerberg up there and handed it to him. And I think a lot of people maybe think that that's not what happened. Putting all that aside, to Nancy's point earlier, the tech industry is powerful. It's spending a lot of money to battle back regulation. It's announced things like more ad transparency on political ads in an attempt to stave off that regulation, to convince lawmakers who are already so busy with other issues that they don't need to get involved in political ads. That's one of their big tools there. So I just increasingly think that the regulatory environment is tough on this stuff. I mean, privacy is something we've talked about for the entirety of my career on this beat. There have been bills on bills on bills that even predate me, and not a single one of them has gotten close to the finish line, and nothing suggests that that's going to change now.
You were maybe one of the first beat reporters in Washington who owned the privacy. You were paying attention to privacy.
My eyebags suggest that.
Nancy, do you think that Facebook has taken a number of steps to curb things like fake news and make more political ads more transparent? Like Tony mentioned, take down hate speech, beef up data policies. They're doing a full review of all of their apps and how they collect data and what the procedures are and notifications are. Do you think, is it seen that Facebook is doing enough? I mean, obviously this is all a public perception game. So do you think they're doing enough, or are they perceived to be doing enough to take back some of those breaches that they announced, the breaches of trust? And do you think that they'll ever be able to kind of strike the right balance there?
I think part of the challenge for them is there is the public perception component for sure, but a lot of this is behind the scenes mechanics. And they're dealing with millions, billions of posts and pieces of content, and they're applying new techniques to them, and in the end we'll know how well they've done to sort of patrol that amount of content and what the effect might be on sort of democratic processes and elections, that sort of thing. So I kind of would give them a little bit of runway to test out some of these things and see if they work. The only problem is the runway ends up with the midterm elections, pretty consequential political outcomes there. The reason why I might be slightly more optimistic than I might otherwise be, because I think you both know, I don't know if it comes across in the public, but Facebook is constantly rolling out new solutions. Like 4 times a week, it's no, we figured out artificial intelligence for combating fake news. And he said, you told me that 2 days ago, and I can't differentiate between the thing you said 2 days ago and the things you're saying today. But the only reason why I'm a little bit more optimistic is because they did a lot of the same tactics around terroristic content on their networks, and which we said, for months and years, lawmakers, regulators said, you need to do something. In particular, at the time it was ISIS, the quote-unquote Islamic State was using Twitter and Facebook to recruit and sort of promote their ideology. And for a long time, the tech industry in general sort of said, these are open platforms, there's not a ton we can do. They were pressure was put on them, they built some tools, they hired some more folks, they made some policy decisions, they wrote clearer guidelines. And even pretty harsh critics of the tech companies in the sort of intelligence community, national security world said, yeah, they've actually cleaned it up considerably and they're doing much better than they've done in the past. So that's why I sort of hesitate to say there's a lot of rhetoric around this. In the end, it's not going to amount to much, because I don't know that we know until it actually plays itself out.
Yeah, I think there are 2 parts to it, right? First is that for as long as it always feels like sorcery to a user, I think Facebook is going to have this trouble. Because I think Nancy's right. They should get some credit. It is a cat and mouse game, but it's hard to know why you see what you see still to this day on Facebook. And then you layer on top of it some of the criticisms that Facebook has faced and other tech sites as well for failing to address these same problems in the past, like online harassment, for instance. It's not like we didn't know that on Twitter, for example, women and journalists and others are constantly facing harassment, and there's a bot problem. These things have been around for a long time. It's just that I think the stakes have manifested themselves in a new way. But I also think that the onus, and this is sometimes difficult to talk about, ends up being on the user to do their part as well. And so going back to your question about regulation, I think one of the promising things here is we're beginning to have a conversation in this country about digital literacy and media literacy. We're beginning to see regulators, particularly at the state and local level, Virginia, Washington, a bunch of others, questioning whether they need to put more money towards digital literacy. There are schools in Virginia, I can think of one in particular, where teachers were talking about the issue of fake news and how to spot fake news around Parkland, Florida, which was a big issue. People were posting hoaxes about the shooting that had happened there, and they had an entire class just talking about how to debunk that. I think that's one of the solutions here, and one of the more promising things here that could address some of the problems that you guys have identified.
But it's not a super politically palatable solution.
No.
And it's not a conversation that we're having much in Washington, and for good reason. The tech industry, Facebook, is not saying the onus is on the users. They need to be better at using this stuff. I think you can easily make the argument that we do need to. I mean, the Russian ads were effective because we were reading them, we were clicking on them, we were being persuaded on them.
Right, and it was more of the propaganda even than the ads, especially, particularly when it came to that. And that's even harder to suss out because it's harder to recognize, and some of that can be subjective, right? And I think that they're in a tough spot because, to your point, like it's always going to be a cat and mouse game, and it's going to be very hard for Facebook's content reviewers to stay ahead of the millions of pieces of content that are posted every day, especially when it is very subjective. What is inappropriate? What is racist? I think if you ask two different people, they will have different answers. What is abusive? What is hate speech versus free speech? And I think that there are some very obvious lines, but then there are some lines that are a little bit in this gray area. And if they do overstep, like they've taken a couple of historical photos down, for nudity, and then there was an outcry for taking down a historically significant, culturally significant photograph due to nudity. So it's almost like it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation for them. Zuckerberg has said that they're going to be putting in place, 20,000, at least 20,000, and adding more and more people, human reviewers of content. But he is still pretty adamant that he thinks that technology is the solution here, and that it's the development of artificial intelligent, like automated systems that will be able to instantaneously recognize fake or nefarious or doctored photos, for example. And I think there's still a lot of skepticism about whether artificial intelligence will be able to stay ahead of the actors that continue to just beef up their own processes in response to that. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about what that balance should be.
Yeah, the artificial intelligence, Facebook put out a bunch of data a few weeks ago about its early efforts to combat the troubles on its platform, and essentially the numbers show, I think it was about 500 million fake accounts over the period that they had identified, people who tried, bots or whatever, that had tried some fake accounts on the platform, and the artificial intelligence was really good at spotting those before they even finished the process of setting up the accounts. But the artificial intelligence was not good at hate speech. The numbers show that. Facebook admitted that it's just not there yet. But whether it's AI or it's humans at the wheel, Facebook and others are always going to be in this position where if they're playing the role of gatekeeper, it's going to make somebody uncomfortable. And the one group that consistently seems to make noise about feeling uncomfortable is the conservative community. Yeah. In recent weeks, we've seen folks like Senator Ted Cruz talk about feeling as though conservatives have their news and views censored on the platform. I think recently the Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee have made this into a campaign issue, also looking to raise money off of it. There was an entire hearing about this on Capitol Hill, whether correct or incorrect. It's certainly taken hold. Some people now believe that Facebook is biased against conservatives, and I think we should look at that as maybe not just a problem in and of itself, but a symptom of a larger problem about fears of bias.
Yeah. Just a data point on that is Rep. Kevin McCarthy, who's the House Majority Leader, tweeted yesterday saying we need to end the social media bias against conservatives. He traditionally has been a strong advocate for technology in the tech industry, so I think we're seeing a little bit of a shift there. I think also we might just need to have a tough public conversation with ourselves about whether we want a company like Facebook in the position of making these decisions at all. Mm-hmm. And is it worth trading away the idea of the internet as sort of this free flow of public discourse to have the sort of more protected, safer, conversations on that platform? Or is that the decision we want to make? If we do, fine, but I don't know we've ever had that in this country.
It's been a very reactionary conversation.
Yeah, and for so long the idea of the internet was we're going to do away with gatekeepers. People are going to be able to say what they want. It might be, it might be tough to deal with at some point, but we'll combat that with more speech and that sort of thing. And it seems like we are kind of like swinging the pendulum back a little bit to say, oh no, we need to be protected from these sort of difficult conversations, and we need to be protected not only by one company, but in the case of Facebook, which is a very dominant platform, by one person, essentially. I mean, he is very nearly total control over that company. So, and if that's a decision we make as sort of as a country and as a world, that we want Mark Zuckerberg making those decisions for us, that's one thing, but I think we should probably proactively make that decision and not just back into it.
Right. Well, and that brings up a very good point about gatekeepers, because I think there's a really interesting dynamic happening between the media industry and Facebook and platforms like Facebook, Google News, Twitter. It's not just Facebook, but I think with the major economic shifts that the media industry has faced, a lot of publishers have become much more reliant on social media platforms as distribution methods for their content to get in front of people, to drive their own traffic. And I think one of the outgrowths of this, this past year for Mark Zuckerberg is he said, look, we're not a media company. I never wanted to be a media company. We're a technology company. And in fact, a lot of these problems, the fake news problems and other things, is actually a root. It can be drawn back to us allowing news to overpopulate news feeds. So we're going to actively deprioritizing news and publishers and media organizations from the news feeds and prioritizing the things that Facebook used to be, or what he wants to get back to, the roots of Facebook. Sharing baby photos, talking about what you ate for breakfast, sharing with friends, talking about your jobs, doing things that are more personal, on a more personal level. And he sees this as being all about finding common ground and connecting with your community. On the flip side of that, though, a lot of the next generations of news consumers rely on platforms like this. They become accustomed to getting a lot of their news from that. So there's this tension here of, well, what does that do to the distribution of legitimate news if you're deprioritizing that in news feeds, and how does that impact the access to information? Not that it's Facebook's job to make sure that people are getting access to information, but there's this interesting tension between the media industry and Facebook and Google and Twitter of what that symbiotic relationship is or should be. Where do you think that that's heading? It seems kind of at a very unhealthy balance right now, frankly.
Yeah. And this, at risk of, this is maybe a controversial opinion, but I think some of the criticism and critique of Facebook over the last year has been in part a reaction to the idea that, not in a sort of punitive way because the news industry is mad at Facebook, but the idea that the news industry recognizes as well as anyone else how dominant Facebook has become. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that there needs to be a check on them, I think, is more personal in some ways and legitimately personal to people in the news business. As far as the question of how do you run a publication that, as we all know, it takes a good deal of money to run a good publication. That money now is the main channel for that is Facebook. How do you do that in a way that is sustainable and you're sort of owning your own destiny as a news organization? Those questions are why I'm glad I'm a reporter and I'm not a news executive, because I have absolutely no answer for that.
Although we are starting to see folks suggest some solutions, and I'm not going to offer a thought as to whether it's a good one or not, but Rupert Murdoch, News Corp, came out and said that he thought Facebook should pay publishers, much in the same way that we have retransmission fees when it comes to cable channels that appear on your Comcast or whatever cable provider you have here, that there should be carriage fees paid to news publishers whose content appears on Facebook. Now, that is a complete non-starter in from Facebook's perspective. That would be the sort of thing that would require regulation to do, or Facebook's goodwill, which it's not going to do. But we are starting to have these conversations at a business level, at a very high business level here in this country, about what responsibilities Facebook should have, whether or not we call it a tech or a media company.
Right, and it goes beyond Facebook too. It's like, what is Google's responsibility? What is Twitter's responsibility? Amazon even, they're just, as these companies dominate and are able to act as gatekeepers in a variety of ways, what is the responsibility of these really rich companies to make sure that some pieces of democracy are strengthened rather than hurt?
And then it becomes a question too of where you draw the line. If Facebook has to pay publishers for content, does Google have to pay? And at what point do we start sort of breaking the fundamental promise of the internet if we sort of
it's a very slippery slope.
Make that an economic transaction.
So we have 1 minute before Q&A from the audience, and I'm actually really interested to hear what you guys have to say. I guess one question I would close with is, what do you guys expect Facebook's role to be in the upcoming elections? The midterms is a really consequential one in a lot of ways, and then we have 2020, which is going to be an all-out circus. Do you think that, given the heightened scrutiny on Facebook, do you think it will actually have will nothing change? Will it continue to play like a key role in advertising, campaigning, getting messages across? Do you have any predictions?
I think the only thing is the impact is going to be, whatever it's going to be, is going to be less than it is on the presidential level, because the elections that we're talking about are congressional races, even statewide races, are just much more personal, more intimate, more on the ground than the presidential races. The presidential race at this point is pretty much a broadcast-driven race, where the broadcast is now Facebook. So I think we won't really know for sure until the next presidential.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to watch is going to be Facebook's new hub for all online political ads. This debuted a week ago. This was Facebook's answer to all of the members of Congress who wanted to see it make more information available about the political campaigns that were advertising and who they were targeting. That database, you can play with it. It's sort of limited in what you can see, but you can get a sense as to how an organization is advertising on an issue of immigration and a general sense as to who's clicking on those sorts of things. It'll be interesting to see if Facebook adds more functionality to that so we can learn more about how campaigns are using Facebook and how things work on there. I think at some point, though, we're going to start having this conversation about statewide elections as well. We have a lot of scrutiny about US elections. There are countries around the world, even outside of 2018 and 2020, who want to see the same transparency measures in their countries, and state lawmakers who feel the same way as well.
Right. Great. So as a reminder, I think we're going to have a lot of questions. I hope we do anyway. So let's keep it moving, and I'll try to keep the conversation moving too. The first 3 questions will be reserved for students, and there's a microphone right here. So if you guys could just form a queue there, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hi. My name's Dylan. I'm a second year in the college. And let me just preface this by saying I am not a conspiracy theorist. I don't wear tinfoil hats or anything. But I've been really curious to sort of see how all these technologies that constantly listen in on us. I know my phone is always listening for me to say, "Hey Siri." Same thing with my HomePod. And I've been struck recently by like very hyper-targeted advertising in my Instagram feed, my Twitter feed, related to things that I never searched online. I'm curious about your insights on this, like the possibility of micro-targeting ads based on conversations that our devices are constantly picking up on us, and whether there's any regulation of that at this point.
Well, there's certainly no regulation of that. That's an easy one to answer. I think that I think that's one reason that the fear that you just outlined is one reason that the digital assistants and the smart speakers have been a little slower to be adopted more widely than I think a lot of the companies really thought, is that there is that fear of uneasiness, right? Of I don't really want something that's always on and capturing what I'm saying because I don't really know how they're using it. There are no real rules around that. And there was that incident, what was it, last week when a Seattle family discovered that Amazon's Alexa had recorded something that they said and actually sent it to someone else. Is that what happened?
Yeah, sent it to somebody in their contact list.
Right, sent it to someone in their contact list. So, and you know, Amazon was very quick to say this was a very rare confluence of events, and it's really won't happen again.
Though, rare.
Yes, very rare, right. But I think that is, you know, when you're thinking about this is something that you never want to happen, rare isn't really that comforting. But I don't see that there's going to be any regulation or real pickup of that anytime soon.
So part of the difference between the European approach on privacy versus the American approach, the European approach is a little bit of a top-down, this fundamental right, people have a right to privacy and it applies across the board. Where in the US we've chosen to regulate based on specific industries pretty much. So your health data is protected, your financial data is protected, a couple other sort of cases there. The things that you say to your personal digital assistant, we have not sort of carved out that silo. So I think that's where we're sort of, you could argue that we're lagging behind because it is just such a new technology.
I would say 2 quick ththings. The first is Gimlet, for everybody who loves podcasts, did a great podcast on this a few months ago because people were convinced that Instagram was listening to them. Facebook and Instagram were like serving them ads based on stuff that they had said in conversation with their friends, and like the TLDR and all of it was, no, you just surrender that much data that it can figure it out. But they said that the companies weren't, and the companies have always denied it. I think an interesting second thing that I'm going to watch for in the coming years is the extent to which these companies that have home assistants, Amazon's Alexa, Apple Siri, and whatnot, start to disclose information about law enforcement requests they receive. We get a lot of information from these companies about law enforcement requests on emails and things of that sort, national security letters, but there's this black box on what federal and state officials try to obtain in terms of recordings, and I think that there are folks on Capitol Hill who'd like to see that happen, but much like Kim and Nancy said, the regulation in the short term, probably not.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Greg. I'm a third year in the college. So it's no secret that most people don't really care too much about personal data, like what they've liked on Facebook. And I think that's in part due to them not really understanding what it's being used for. Like Cambridge Analytica knows that I've liked Reese's Puffs, for example. Like, why should I care about that? How do you communicate to people the importance of their data and their privacy when how it's being used by companies is ambiguous or, like, sometimes at times a trade secret?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's exactly what Europe was trying to address through its data protection regulation, the GDPR, because they felt that consumers just didn't know. I think, admittedly, as reporters, this is something that we struggle with on a regular basis, like trying to convey to people the importance of all this stuff. And then when something bad happens, like the major hack on Equifax, which I think didn't nearly get enough attention as it should have, what it means for them that their social security numbers and all their information is out there. And I think that's why Facebook has taken a lot of criticism. They, as a result of GDPR, they had to present people with screens, basically updating them on what they were taking, what they were collecting, and why. And there were so many screens, even just to get through that, and even just to opt out of that data collection. This is the big issue that we're struggling with here, and I think for as long as the US government and for the US Congress doesn't consider what a comprehensive commercial online privacy law would look like, people are going to continue to have that very question.
Yeah, one of Facebook's responses during the Cambridge Analytica situation was, we're going to show you what the sort of targeted data that we have on you, but go and look up what the consumer data brokers. So what are the I'm trying to remember some of the companies like
Experian,
that sort of thing have
Axiom,
on you.
TransUnion.
That's what's going to terrify you, not what Facebook has on you, which I think is like a somewhat valid argument. But I don't know, I'm constantly amazed that to some people, for someone to be able to say to me, you subscribe to this magazine, you vacation here, that sort of thing, that might freak me out. The next person sitting next to me is not bothered by that in the least. And I think that's something we haven't probed enough. Is that generational? Is that geographical? I think we don't have a clear sense of that yet. So.
Right.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen, and I'm a fourth year in the college. So I know when it comes to like content moderation, the U.S. government is very limited in sort of what they can do to regulate these sort of things due to the First Amendment. And as you guys mentioned, these companies often sort of operate in a black box in terms of their internal operations and policies. So I was just wondering what you guys think can be done to make these companies more accountable to their consumers and users.
I mean, the public pressure is definitely having an impact, and I think that beyond Facebook, the other companies are watching because they know that whatever happens to Facebook is going to have a pretty big impact on them as well. And that was the question that we didn't get to about what Google and others are thinking about or how they're reacting to the Facebook situation. The Federal Communications Commission was designed before the internet existed, really. Well, yeah, it was because it was 1934. And in a very different era. And so the FCC was designed to regulate broadcasts and newspapers to a certain extent, but mostly just like media ownership and very the old school style of communication. And there has been people who have argued, mostly on the left, who are trying to make the case for breaking up some of these companies or taking a very aggressive approach, have said that there needs to be a new information commission of some sort, Federal Information Commission, to do the same thing that the FCC does for broadcasters and other types of media, to do that for the internet companies as well. However, I just don't see I don't see an impetus for that happening. So I think it's still going to be, the public perception pressure and making sure that they're going to respond to these kinds of uprisings and scandals, to be honest.
And regulatory pressure as well, but in a different way than when Kim said. Like in the EU, again, A Tale of Two Continents is like the story of this panel, right? And that Vera Jourova, who's the Justice Commissioner for the European Union, has been really active on this front, particularly with respect to hate speech. They've gone through this whole process in the EU to force companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter to take down, offensive content within 24 hours of being notified that it exists. And it's a really big challenge in a place like Germany, where Nazi paraphernalia on Twitter was, kept showing up, and that's just not the sort of thing you can do. And, Jourova was really successful at getting those companies to respond quickly. So successful for a period of time that there was a campaign on Twitter where some folks were setting their location to Germany in an attempt to get faster access to the company's eyeballs so they could do things about the harassment that users were experiencing. Regulators there have figured out that they can use the cattle prod to get companies to change their practices. That's just not the sort of thing we're seeing here, and I think it's a First Amendment thing. I think it's always going to be a third rail issue when government is telling any company how to moderate content, even if everybody in this room agrees that some of the content is abhorrent.
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge of thinking about the sort of public pressures and any sort of check on these companies and the sort of protecting against the sort of content that you're thinking about. Tony mentioned this delete Facebook campaign, and it didn't seem to gain much traction because part of the thinking is, well, where do people go, right? You know,
there's no alternative.
Yeah, and Mark Zuckerberg argues very vigorously, we are not a monopoly. People have a lot of choices in their lives, but there's no sort of perfect replacement for Facebook. Some people would say, if antitrust law does not think of Facebook as a monopoly, we need to rethink antitrust law, and that's the conversation we're having right now in DC around this.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a third year in the college. I'm just thinking about how it seems like people kind of inevitably surround themselves mostly by people who have similar views, or like, you know, they live in communities with people with similar views, and they read newspapers that kind of tell them things they already believe and things like that. That's just human tendency. And I'm thinking sort of broadly, like, if you regulate Facebook more, I'm wondering if that will have the net effect of leading to less like open discussion, or less just like compromise and like open discourse between people, and less progress, or more progress. Because with more regulation, it seems like people will still surround themselves mainly with views that are the same, and it seems like maybe even like having less regulation, even though people can still end up like liking pages that all, you know, I'm wondering if having less regulation leads to people to be even more extremified in their views, or less so, because maybe the net effect is, you know, if there's less regulation, there will just be more discourse in general, and people are at least more likely to run into ideas contrary to their own on the internet. But if there's more regulation, then people will still surround themselves with ideas that are similar to their own. So what do you think is like the net effect of having less versus more regulation? Yeah,
one of the self-policing mechanisms that Facebook and other companies use is this idea that users will flag content they find objectionable, and then it'll go in front of human reviewers. So the idea that it's almost easier to operate a social network if you do sort of only pitch it to one sort of group of people thinking one way, right? They're not going to flag each other if they are all sort of thinking similar things. And they're using it as a way to avoid regulation, so it's sort of their own sort of so that's sort of one way of saying, that's an interesting question I may steal as the basis for a story. Thank you for that. But yeah, I haven't thought about it a ton, but it's provocative idea.
Although people use that tool for the opposite purpose, which is to mess with people whose views they don't agree with. They screw around with the report this as offensive or whatnot in an attempt to stifle that conversation. I think one of the more interesting things that folks have done in this space, I want to say it was just before the 2016 election, where the Wall Street Journal created a side-by-side, like what you would see on your Facebook news feed if you were a Democrat or a left-leaning voter, and what you would see if you were a conservative who had surrounded yourself with those views, and it's completely different. I mean, there might as well be a different service. That's just the extent to which those filter bubbles are severe, but admittedly, I think the question is less about regulating Facebook to address that problem, or the fears of it being worse. That's just the political climate that we're in. You can add in things like cable news to that conversation, which we've been talking about for a long time in terms of becoming more extreme, becoming more partisan. I think in this case, with respect to political viewpoints, it's the case that it's across the board. It's beyond just social media.
Yeah, but I do wonder how much of that is cause and effect, how much the fact that people are having these discussions on platforms that reward sort of extremist positions has created a little bit of this political dynamic that we're seeing.
I think that definitely has something to it. I mean, if your content with an extremist or salacious or over-the-top very polarizing headline has been shown that they rise much higher up to the top of news feeds and get a ton more traffic, a ton more clicks, and it's part of this feedback loop that the algorithms help to fuel. So there is definitely, it happens more pronounced way, but at the same time, the cable news, I mean, this is all about business, this is all about human nature, and this is going to happen on any we tend as humans to congregate with people who are like ourselves and have similar views. I think some of this is societal and just how our communities have changed, both online and offline. And I think the death of local media has really played a role in this too. So there's all of these threads kind of coming in together that really hit a peak, that we're all kind of waking up to it as a result of the 2016 election, I think.
Thank you.
Hi there, thank you for coming here to the IOP. I'm Jennifer and I'm a second-year master's student in public policy. And so my question is more on the culture. I think it's very interesting the issues that we're facing right now and where we are at as a society, because we have these older generations who didn't necessarily grow up with social media or technology, but they're clearly concerned about some of the issues we're facing. And I think you saw that in the Mark Zuckerberg testimony. These senators are very concerned, but they don't really understand how the technology works, or and it's hard to kind of decide how to move forward if you don't really know the underlying foundation of something. But on the flip side, you have all these younger generations who have grown up with technology, then they've just been surrounded by social media, and then in turn you'll have future generations who their entire lives will be on social media. It's become very popular to post everything about your kids on social media. So there are people who be growing up with their entire lives on social media, and you'll have very comprehensive profiles of people. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on how, as we move forward in the future, how culture will play a role in how we view technology policy, and if there will be a tipping point with these people who have such comprehensive social media profiles, or if it'll be so normalized at that point that people won't really think about privacy or know what that would even look like.
It's a great question.
I used to, so I mentioned I worked on Capitol Hill back in, so this was I'm going to date myself, so 2001, 2005, that sort of.
Oh my gosh,
and
Nancy.
Part of I've been doing this a very long time. And part of the thinking then was, we just kind of have to wait people out, because the people that were, running Congress at that point had never used the technologies that were then becoming so popular, so we'll just wait until we get members of Congress who are the digital native generation. And I think that was sort of at top of mind when we had the Senate hearing with Mark Zuckerberg on the Tuesday, I think it was, and then we said, those questions weren't great, let's wait for the House, because the House tends to be a younger group of lawmakers. Their questions will be better. And I think maybe you could argue that they were marginally better, but they were not terrific. So I think I used to be a little bit more optimistic about the argument of if we get people that are more hands-on, have grown up with these technologies, that they'll be better at regulating them. I don't think, I'm less optimistic about that than I was.
Yeah, I guess I have two thoughts there. The first is that I thought that was going to happen as a result of major security breaches before it happened with privacy. But I feel I thought that years ago, Target got hacked, and I was this is going to be the one, because everybody knows what Target is, and it wasn't. And then Sony got hacked shortly after, and I was well, this is definitely going to be the one now, because your kid's PlayStation's in trouble. And then that wasn't. And we've just gone through example and example and example of this. And to the Equifax thing that I had mentioned earlier, I think people are just sort of kind of numb to it at some level. The belief is, my stuff is probably already stolen. My friends make that joke. They're my stuff's already out there probably. It's not that big of a deal at this point. I worry that that's going to happen in other contexts as well. And then to Nancy's point about the difference in the House and the Senate, I sat down with Ro Khanna, who's a Democratic congressman from the Silicon Valley area and somebody who's worked on tech stuff for a long time. And he and I were having this conversation about what do you do to fix this problem? How do you get Congress more up to speed on tech issues? Is the solution maybe to get more coders or something? And he kind of laughed at me, and he was well, we have people in Congress who aren't doctors, and we do healthcare policy, and we have people in Congress who never served in the military, and we can work on defense, but we have nobody here. We have some coders here, but that hasn't really permeated the rest of the Hill, young and old members. I think that'll maybe change if this is something that people demand at the ballot box, and it'll definitely change if lawmakers start using the technology themselves as opposed to delegating it to their staffs to do, who happen to be a younger set of people.
Thank you.
Just as one more data point, just to throw in, one of the things I was hearing on Capitol Hill during this Facebook sort of Cambridge Analytica situation, where members were reacting so strongly about this, more strongly than they've reacted to most anything else I've ever experienced in the Iraq War, all sorts of, but they were very upset about this Cambridge Analytica situation. And someone explained to me that, and this is anecdotal, but that lawmakers and politicians have come to rely on Facebook to run for office. Yeah. And yet they're frustrated because they don't get a lot of insight into how these tools actually work on the ground. So they give this example of Facebook came in and they do these briefings for members of Congress all the time and said, you need to use your tools to reach out to your constituents in the sort of the course of the work of your office. And so lawmakers said, okay, we'll do that, and they sort of jumped on board. And then at some point, Facebook changed the algorithm by which they identified where people live, so whether or not they lived in their district. And so the members of Congress were saying, we're not reaching out to the same percentage of the population of voters as we were in the past. Obviously, that's bad come election day. So they called Facebook back in and said, please explain to us how you changed your algorithm in this way to affect us. And they said, no, we cannot tell you. Yeah. And they said that sort of like carried on that sort of anger of, okay, we've, in the same way as the news industry is sort of, we've latched ourselves to Facebook, okay, we're gonna get the upside, but they're feeling like they're sort of like being taken for a ride now, so that's some of the personal sort of frustrations.
Oh, that's interesting.
Hello, I'm Avery, I'm a 4th year in the college. So I'm not a tech savvy person. I did not read watch the trial, nope. But something that I do see is the ads on the subway, and also like when I'm watching shows on like Amazon or something. It'll talk about, it's ads for Facebook where it says like, spam is not your friend, fake news is not your friend, we're prioritizing your friends now. And to me it just feels like Facebook's acting like fake news and spam happened to them, like as if they weren't doing something there. So I was wondering, what do you think is the relationship between the public and Facebook? Is it fair for them to post ads like this that kind of make them, we're like you, we just want you to see your friends? Like, what is that type of relationship? What does that do to public perception for people like me that, I mean, I didn't buy it, but if you aren't following this, like people here are, what is it to see these ads where Facebook says that they're doing all these things, but you guys have already discussed that. What they're really doing, hard to say, they have to update all the time, so.
What's funny about those ads is that they started appearing, in person, they started appearing in major newspapers as full-page advertisements before they appeared on Facebook. You literally had to be looking at quote-unquote legacy media to see some of that stuff at first. And then eventually, at the top of the news feed, Facebook started devoting limited space to it. I was on Instagram a couple days ago, and I saw the ad in the middle of my feed. I thought that was telling. This is something about who Facebook is trying to reach and what they're looking to accomplish. And it seemed to me, and this is complete conjecture, maybe you guys disagree, that was actually more about getting to some of its either older users or people who weren't on Facebook and had heard, media coverage about it on TV news in the paper that they're reading. They wanted to be side by side next to that. That's sort of how I took a lot of that. Maybe you guys disagree, but they can advertise all they want. The problem exists with or without the ad, and maybe it'll affect the polling, but I think so far it's not really had that much of a dent. But again, maybe you guys disagree.
Yeah. I actually don't have a proper response to that, but the one sort of anecdote I'll tell is that when I saw one of those ads on the Metro, I don't know if you feel the same way, but they're very poorly designed. Like the fonts don't line up, they overlap. And I actually emailed Facebook and said, are these really yours? Because I saw it on the subway and I thought, oh, that can't be. Like, you have, heaps of designers on staff. This isn't one. And they were like, no, those are ours, and that sort of thing. And I sort of joked that if you had an actual disclaimer paid for by Facebook, which is part of the argument about like the political ads, that there's no disclaimer on those sort of things, we would actually know it was yours. So maybe in the future you should put a little disclaimer on them. But I think they're strangely worded. I don't know if people have seen them, but like and actually my first thought when I saw it on the Metro was it reads as if it were translated from like Russian. But God bless, they're trying.
That's funny. I think that actually, to your point about like the attitude of like this just happened to us, I think the explanation that they've used multiple times, and Zuckerberg said this in the hearings multiple times, is that we in his mea culpa, it was we didn't realize how much these nefarious actors were taking advantage, and I think that language was very telling of like we are running this very this optimistic, this like we're about connecting people. We have a very positive purpose, and people took advantage of that and made it and hijacked it, for the dark side. And so I think there is a little bit of denial maybe still about like, that they didn't see this coming, or that they saw things trickle but didn't realize the magnitude of it. And I think they're still coming to terms with that, to be honest.
there's so much, again, like not to harp on it, but there's such a PR element to all of this. Then one of the top places you will see some of these ads from Facebook is on Fox News. You know, they're running during primetime programming on Fox News right now, and that has everything to do with the fact that they're dealing with this problem of conservative bias. They're trying to explain to people who are really sensitive to this issue and truly believe Facebook is messing with what they're seeing and why, you know, this is what we're actually after. This is what we're trying to accomplish here. It really says something about who they think their audience is and why they have to target them in the first place.
Yeah, I think the passive orientation you mentioned, that comes up again and again. Zuckerberg testified to sort of that idea of, that we saw this thing happening only after the fact we were taken advantage of. At some point he wrote in a blog post, you know, our mission has always been to connect the world for good. Unfortunately, as it turns out, some people don't share that vision, which you thought you probably should have figured that out before reaching 30 and being the CEO of an enormous company. But I've lost my train of thought. But yeah, I think it's, the point I was going to make is that I think in some ways this is still an outgrowth of their thinking of themselves as a startup, which is remarkable, I think, to think from the outside. It's such a huge company at this point, but they still have that orientation of we're kind of just making it up as we go along.
Right.
Yeah.
And we have time for 2 more questions.
Thanks. So my question is, I guess, you know, Facebook kind of has a similar business model to a media company in many ways, like, you know, attracting eyeballs and selling advertisements, and yet it's considered like a crazy idea that Facebook could be a media company. And since you all work in journalism, I just wanted to ask, you know, is it actually that crazy of an idea for Facebook to be a media company? Could you see journalists or editors going to work there to, you know, try and sort of right the ship on, you know, all the types of content that they have going on? And, you know, with all their resources and energy that could be, you know, dedicated towards this, why are they pulling back rather than leaning into this?
Well, Facebook does have journalists that have, Cable Brown? Yeah, so she's over there. She's doing a lot of work for the Facebook News team. They did have people, but I guess you then get into some of the other controversies that we've talked about. There was this whole thing, I want to say it's in 2016, but I'm an old person and I forget stuff now. And like there was a whole issue about trending topics. There were human beings that were curating some of the stories that appeared in the sidebar of your news feed just to get you the most important things that, you know, they thought you should be seeing. And there were many conservatives who felt that within that team, people were excluding conservative news sites from there. Now, you know, folks at Facebook say that that wasn't the case. They were trying to keep hoaxes and other bad content from appearing there, but that was an example of when Facebook's reliance on humans as opposed to technology, as Nancy was talking about earlier, kind of came back to bite it. I think a lot of journalists maybe wouldn't want to play that game. I don't know, I can't speak for others in the industry on that piece, but with its media company versus technology company fight, really it's just an issue about how much responsibility they should have for what's on there. They really see themselves as this canvas where they think the best ideas will duke it out with the worst ideas and the best ideas will prevail, but increasingly that just doesn't seem to be necessarily
it's a numbers
the case.
game, and there's never going to be more good than bad, unfortunately.
Yeah. It'll worry other media companies, though, if journalists go to Facebook to help them out or to help stand up their news product. I mean, when Apple News was hiring folks to help them curate the news that was appearing on the app, journalists freaked out. They were like, "Oh my God, Apple's going to like kill us. They're going to take our clicks. They're going to determine, you know, how the ad revenue gets to us and stuff." And that didn't really manifest itself that way. So there's always some trepidation on the reporter side or the higher ups at our organizations on their side about that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are countries in the world in which the internet is Facebook.
Yeah.
And meaning that just the vast majority of people, when they go on the internet, they're going through sort of the Facebook portal. And so I think it does concern me to think if they are the dominant platform in that country and then the sole publisher, that I think that does a weird thing to sort of people's exposures to like new ideas that Facebook might not be supportive of. So I think in the United States it's less of a concern because we can get our news elsewhere. I would worry about it in other places where there's less diversity.
And Zuckerberg fundamentally does not think of himself think of Facebook as a media company. He is adamant that it's a technology company. And that's one reason that he is really trying to refocus on what Facebook started with rather than the news. But you know, Facebook is not just a startup anymore, to Nancy's point. And I think it's still trying to think, well, we can just change what people come to Facebook for. And I think that ship has sailed.
Yeah. Media is a highly regulated industry. We regulate airwaves. We regulate what's on there.
Which might be why he does not.
It's like, maybe not.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, I think it's interesting to note that I'm the only non-student who's asked a question today, which I think is the first we've had in months of events. My question is actually about, we've been talking about government potentially regulating Facebook or other social media companies to sort of curb some of the problems that are emerging. And I guess I'm wondering from a different angle what you think the potential is for shareholder engagement as a potential forcing mechanism to get publicly traded social media companies to sort of take some responsibility for the ills of the industry. And I'm thinking a little bit about, I know there was a recent example where a hedge fund, JANA Partners, compelled Apple to fund research at least into the mental health effects of iPhone addiction, to sort of at least get at the problem of, you know, what are the possible negative side effects to their business model. So I'm wondering, do you think there's a potential that we might see some activism from shareholders compelling social media companies to try to get at this if we're not going to see government regulation potentially in the near future?
It certainly worked on the diversity front for some of the activists who were really pushing you know, Apple and others to release the data on the employees that they hire, which tech companies for years fought against doing. Jesse Jackson and others were really successful at kind of making that change. And then that led to folks putting pressure on those companies to actually then hire more people from diverse backgrounds, which that's another panel, I suppose. But I haven't heard a whole lot about it happening. Some people have talked a little bit about it. They've also tried to use class action lawsuits, I know, to force changes at these companies. But like the cynic in me has to say that like the shareholders have to acknowledge then that the company may not be valued as highly as it is at the time that they push the proposal. And for some of these companies, like Facebook in particular, you know, they're a very close-knit group. Like people at Menlo Park, like at headquarters and stuff, like they are very insular. And I think sometimes the shareholders can adopt the character of the companies in which they have some of those shares. So I do wonder if that might preclude some of that stuff from working, but I haven't really seen a whole lot of it yet.
Yeah.
I haven't heard any of that
yet.
And
Zuckerberg has made this point that the changes he's making to the newsfeed that Kim talked about and sort of prioritizing this person-to-person content rather than sort of commercial content, it is going to, he says it's going to decrease the amount of time people spend on the site, which is going to potentially make the company less valuable. It's good for Mark Zuckerberg to say other people, other CEOs aren't in a position to say something similar. And I just want to sort of steal the opportunity to also make the point that one of the things that we're seeing is that companies are also, tech companies in particular, are pretty responsive to their employees. So it's a different sort of group of constituents, but that a lot of the sort of public responses, it's been explained to me sometimes that they're doing that, a big audience for that is their employees themselves, right? Because there's so much competition to keep engineers in Silicon Valley that if people decide, oh, it's no longer like, you know, impressive to work at Uber because now Uber's a bad company, they can just hop to some other company, and companies do worry about that.
That's a good point.
Facebook has a blog called Hard Questions, I don't know if this, where they debate policy issues, and that was sort of explained to me that is a very big audience for that is internally to prove to their employees that they're actually taking these questions seriously. But
remember, when Cambridge Analytica blew up and Facebook stock had just completely tanked, there wasn't even really a meaningful conversation about replacing Mark Zuckerberg. Like think about like many other companies and the big boardroom dramas that you would see around some of that stuff. Didn't really see that kind of thing because some of these founders have like super ultra duper major voting shares in their companies and are very hard to hold accountable in that way. That started to kind of shift, I think, around a different controversy, which was Uber and Travis Kalanick and some of the troubles that had befallen that ride-sharing app. But you know, they do have a lot of power, which I do wonder if that makes it even harder to mount efforts against them.
And just Zuckerberg did a call with reporters right after some of the Cambridge Analytica controversy, and someone said to him, "Do you think you're, you know?" And this he was being very deferential, very apologetic. This was the beginning of the apology tour, and someone said to him, "Do you think you're at risk of being replaced as CEO?" And he kind of paused and said, "No." That was the one thing that was just not on the table.
Non-starter.
Yeah.
So look to Washington then.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who came out this evening. We had a great time. I loved hearing your questions. This was great. I think that there's no telling where this is going to go. This can go in a lot of different directions. But please keep in touch with us if you guys have thoughts on where we should be looking or the new platforms that you think are way cooler than Facebook. Let us know of that too, because we're Luddites up here and old people, as Tony said. So, but thank you again. Really had fun talking.
Thanks everybody.